Princess Isabella stood in the grand marble hallway of Ravencrest Palace, her emerald gown rustling as she paced back and forth. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. She clutched a crumpled letter in her trembling hands, her face pale with shock and disbelief. The letter had arrived just an hour ago, delivered by a mysterious courier who disappeared before anyone could question him. The contents were devastating. Someone knew about her secret meetings with Lord Alexander, the young diplomat from the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. Someone knew about their forbidden romance that could destroy the fragile peace treaty between their nations. Isabella's stepmother, Queen Morgana, had made it clear from the beginning that Isabella was to marry Prince Edmund of Valoria to strengthen their kingdom's military alliance. The arranged marriage was scheduled for next month, and preparations were already underway. The entire kingdom was celebrating what they believed would be a union of love and prosperity. But Isabella's heart belonged elsewhere. For 6 months she had been secretly meeting Alexander in the palace gardens under the cover of darkness. Their love had blossomed like the roses in the royal garden, beautiful but dangerous. Alexander was everything Prince Edmund was not, kind, intelligent, and genuinely caring. While Edmund was known for his arrogance and cruel treatment of servants, Alexander treated everyone with respect and dignity. The letter contained detailed information about their secret meetings, including specific dates, times, and even quotes from their private conversations. Someone had been watching them, documenting everything. The writer demanded that Isabella end her relationship with Alexander immediately, or the information would be revealed to Queen Morgana and the royal council. Isabella's mind raced as she tried to identify the blackmailer. It could be anyone in the palace, a jealous courtier, a rival kingdom spy, or even someone close to the royal family. The palace was full of people who would benefit from her downfall or from preventing the peace treaty with Astoria. As she stood there contemplating her limited options, she heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, she tucked the letter into her bodice and composed herself. Her younger brother, Prince Marcus, appeared around the corner, his face bright with excitement. "Isabella, Mother is looking for you," he announced cheerfully. "She wants to discuss the final details for your wedding dress fitting tomorrow. The seamstresses from the capital have arrived with the most beautiful fabrics you've ever seen." Isabella forced a smile, though her heart felt like it was breaking. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll be there shortly." As her brother skipped away, Isabella realized she was trapped. Every path forward seemed to lead to heartbreak or disaster. If she revealed the truth about her feelings for Alexander, it would cause a diplomatic crisis that could lead to war. If she went through with the marriage to Edmund, she would be condemning herself to a lifetime of misery with a man she despised. But there was something else troubling her about the letter. The handwriting looked familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. The paper was expensive, the kind used only by nobility or wealthy merchants. This wasn't the work of a common spy or servant. Someone with significant resources and access to the palace was orchestrating this scheme. Isabella walked to her private chambers, her mind spinning with possibilities. She needed to find Alexander and warn him about the letter. They had planned to meet tonight in their usual spot by the old oak tree near the palace's eastern wall. But now that meeting could be a trap. As she reached her room, she noticed something strange. Her jewelry box was slightly open, though she distinctly remembered closing it that morning. Someone had been in her chambers, searching through her belongings. Her private diary was missing from its hiding spot behind the loose stone in the fireplace. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The blackmailer wasn't just watching their meetings. They had been inside her most private spaces, reading her innermost thoughts and feelings. Every word she had written about Alexander, every dream she had confided to her diary was now in enemy hands. Isabella sank onto her bed, overwhelmed by the magnitude of her situation. She was fighting an invisible enemy who seemed to know her every move before she made it. The walls of the palace, which had once felt like protection, now felt like a prison closing in around her. Tomorrow's dress fitting would be just another step toward a future she dreaded. But tonight she had to make a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of 2 kingdoms. The letter had given her until midnight to decide. Would she sacrifice her happiness for peace or risk everything for love? As the sun began to set outside her window, Isabella knew that whatever happened next would change her life forever. The game of royal politics had become deeply personal, and she was no longer just a princess. She was a pawn in someone else's dangerous scheme. The clock tower chimed 11 times as Isabella made her way through the darkened corridors of Ravencrest Palace. She had changed into a simple black cloak, hoping to blend into the shadows as she moved toward her secret meeting place with Alexander. Every step echoed softly against the stone walls, and she paused frequently to listen for other footsteps that might indicate she was being followed. The palace felt different at night. During the day, it bustled with activity, servants rushing about their duties, courtiers engaged in political discussions, and visitors seeking audiences with the royal family. But now, in the quiet darkness, every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made her heart race with anxiety. Isabella clutched the blackmail letter tightly in her hand. She had read it dozens of times, searching for any clue about the writer's identity. The more she studied it, the more convinced she became that someone very close to the royal family was behind this scheme. The intimate knowledge of her daily routines, the access to her private chambers, and the expensive writing materials all pointed to someone with significant status and resources. As she approached the eastern wing of the palace, Isabella noticed something unusual. A faint light was flickering in Queen Morgana's private study, though the queen usually retired to her chambers by 10 o'clock each evening. Isabella crept closer to the window, careful to stay hidden in the shadows of the garden below. Through the partially open curtains, she could see Queen Morgana sitting at her ornate writing desk, speaking in hushed tones with someone whose back was turned to the window. Isabella couldn't make out the conversation, but the queen's gestures were animated and urgent. Whatever they were discussing was clearly important and secretive. The mystery visitor suddenly stood up, and Isabella gasped softly as she recognized the figure. It was Lord Chancellor Blackwood, Queen Morgana's most trusted advisor and the man responsible for negotiating the peace treaty with Astoria. What could they be discussing so late at night, especially when the Chancellor supposedly left the palace hours ago? Isabella's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. Lord Chancellor Blackwood had access to everything: the royal schedules, private chambers, diplomatic correspondence, and most importantly, detailed knowledge of the political implications of her relationship with Alexander. He would know exactly how to use this information to manipulate the situation to his advantage. But why would he want to sabotage her happiness? The answer came to her suddenly: money and power. If the marriage to Prince Edmund proceeded as planned, Blackwood would receive substantial rewards from the Valorian court for his role in securing the alliance. However, if Isabella chose Alexander instead, it would strengthen ties with Astoria, potentially diminishing Valoria's influence and Blackwood's personal wealth. Isabella realized she needed to get to Alexander immediately and warn him about the danger they were both in. She hurried through the garden toward their meeting place, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. Perhaps they could find evidence of Blackwood's scheme, or maybe they could convince King Frederick, her father, to listen to reason about the marriage arrangement. The old oak tree stood majestically in the moonlight, its massive branches creating deep shadows where she and Alexander usually met. But as Isabella approached, she noticed something was wrong. Alexander was already there, but he wasn't alone. Two figures in dark clothing flanked him, and even from a distance she could see that his hands were bound behind his back. Isabella froze, her blood turning to ice. This was clearly a trap, and Alexander had walked directly into it. She watched in horror as one of the figures, she could now see it was a palace guard she didn't recognize, forced Alexander to his knees. The other figure stepped forward into the moonlight, and Isabella's worst fears were confirmed when she saw Lord Chancellor Blackwood's cold, calculating face. "You really thought you could pursue a princess without consequences?" Blackwood's voice carried clearly through the still night air. "Your romantic foolishness is about to cost both kingdoms dearly." Alexander lifted his head defiantly. "Isabella has the right to choose her own future. This arranged marriage is nothing more than a political transaction that ignores her happiness and well-being." Blackwood laughed coldly. "Happiness? Well-being? You clearly don't understand how royal politics work, young diplomat. Princess Isabella's personal desires are irrelevant compared to the stability and prosperity of our kingdom." Isabella watched helplessly as Blackwood pulled out a familiar-looking piece of paper, undoubtedly another copy of the blackmail letter. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out how to help Alexander without walking into the same trap herself. "Here's what's going to happen," Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a menacing tone. "You're going to write a letter to Princess Isabella, telling her that you never loved her and that you were only using her to gain political information about Ravencrest. You're going to tell her that you're returning to Astoria immediately and never want to see her again." "I'll never write such lies," Alexander replied firmly, though Isabella could hear the strain in his voice. Blackwood nodded to the guards, and one of them struck Alexander across the face with such force that he nearly fell over. Isabella had to cover her mouth to prevent herself from crying out. "You'll write the letter," Blackwood said calmly, "or you'll spend the rest of your very short life in our dungeon, charged with espionage against the crown. And don't think your diplomatic immunity will protect you. I have ways of making that disappear as well." Isabella realized that Alexander was in immediate physical danger, and she was the only one who could help him, but confronting Blackwood directly would be suicide. He held all the power and had clearly planned this scenario carefully. She needed to be smart and strategic if she wanted to save the man she loved and expose Blackwood's treachery. As she crept backward into the deeper shadows of the garden, Isabella began formulating a desperate plan. She would have to risk everything, including her own safety. But it might be the only way to save Alexander and prevent Blackwood from destroying both their lives for his own selfish gain. Isabella raced back through the palace corridors, her heart pounding with urgency and fear. She had witnessed enough to understand that Lord Chancellor Blackwood was willing to use violence and false accusations to achieve his goals. Alexander's life was in immediate danger, and she was running out of time to save him. Her first instinct was to run to her father, King Frederick, and tell him everything. But she quickly realized that approaching the king directly might make things worse. Blackwood had been the king's trusted advisor for over 15 years, and without concrete evidence of his treachery, her word alone might not be enough to convince her father. Worse yet, Blackwood might learn of her accusations and take even more drastic action against Alexander. Instead, Isabella decided to seek help from an unexpected source. She made her way to the servants' quarters where she knew she could find Thomas, the elderly head groundskeeper who had worked at the palace since before she was born. Thomas had always been kind to her, and more importantly, he knew every secret passage and hidden entrance in the entire palace complex. Isabella found Thomas in his small chamber, reading by candlelight. His weathered face showed surprise when she knocked softly on his door, but he immediately recognized the urgency in her expression. "Your Highness, what brings you to the servants' quarters at this hour?" Thomas asked, setting aside his book and standing respectfully. "Thomas, I need your help desperately," Isabella whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Someone I care about is in terrible danger, and I need to gather evidence to prove that Lord Chancellor Blackwood is involved in a conspiracy against the crown." Thomas's expression grew serious. He had observed palace politics for decades and had seen how power could corrupt even the most trusted officials. "What do you need me to do, Princess?" Isabella quickly explained her plan. She needed to get into Blackwood's private office to search for evidence of his scheme, letters, documents, or anything that might prove his involvement in the blackmail plot. Thomas knew of a secret passage that connected the old wine cellar to Blackwood's office, a remnant from the days when the palace needed hidden escape routes during times of war. "It's dangerous, Your Highness," Thomas warned. "If you're caught in the Chancellor's office without permission, he could accuse you of treason or espionage. Your royal status might not protect you if he can convince the king that you were acting against the kingdom's interests. The danger to me is nothing compared to what Alexander is facing right now," Isabella replied firmly. "I've seen Blackwood's true nature tonight, and I know he won't hesitate to hurt innocent people to protect his own interests." Thomas studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I've suspected for some time that the Chancellor wasn't as loyal as he appeared. There have been too many coincidences, too many convenient developments that seem to benefit him personally. Follow me, but we must be absolutely silent." Thomas led Isabella through a maze of narrow corridors and hidden staircases that she never knew existed. The secret passages were dusty and dark, clearly unused for many years. As they moved through the hidden routes, Thomas shared what he had observed about Blackwood's recent behavior. "He's been receiving visitors at odd hours," Thomas whispered as they climbed a narrow stone staircase. people who don't appear in the official visitor logs. And I've noticed him burning papers in his fireplace almost every night, even during the warm summer months when no heat is needed. They emerged behind a tapestry in an alcove near Blackwood's office. Thomas checked the corridor carefully before signaling that it was safe to proceed. The Chancellor's office door was locked, but Thomas produced a set of master keys that he had carried for decades. "I'll keep watch," Thomas whispered. "You have perhaps 20 minutes before the night guards make their next rounds through this section of the palace." Isabella slipped into Blackwood's office, her heart racing with nervous energy. The room was elegantly furnished with dark wood furniture and expensive decorations, all chosen to project an image of power and sophistication. She began searching through the papers on his desk, looking for anything that might connect him to the blackmail scheme. Most of the documents were routine administrative matters, trade agreements, tax records, and diplomatic correspondence. But as Isabella searched more carefully, she discovered a hidden drawer in the desk that contained much more interesting materials. Inside the drawer, she found copies of her own private letters that had somehow been intercepted, detailed surveillance reports about her daily activities, and most damning of all, correspondence with Prince Edmund of Valoria that revealed the true nature of their arrangement. The letters showed that Prince Edmund had promised Blackwood substantial financial rewards and a position in the Valorian court if the marriage proceeded as planned. But more shocking was the revelation that Edmund had specifically requested detailed information about Isabella's personality, habits, and vulnerabilities so that he could properly control his future wife. Isabella felt sick as she read Edmund's cruel words about how he planned to isolate her from her family and friends once they were married, ensuring that she would be completely dependent on him. The arranged marriage wasn't just a political alliance. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to trap her in an abusive relationship that would benefit both Edmund and Blackwood. She also found evidence that Blackwood had been selling information to multiple foreign courts, playing different kingdoms against each other while profiting from the conflicts he helped create. The blackmail scheme against her was just the latest in a long series of manipulations designed to increase his wealth and influence. As Isabella photographed the documents with a small camera she had brought, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Thomas's urgent whisper reached her through the door. "Someone's coming. You need to leave immediately." Isabella quickly returned the papers to their hiding place and prepared to escape through the secret passage. But as she reached the tapestry, she heard Blackwood's voice in the corridor, much closer than she had expected. "I want those documents prepared by morning," Blackwood was saying to someone. "The princess will sign the marriage contract tomorrow, whether she wants to or not. And make sure our friend from Astoria understands that his diplomatic career is over if he doesn't cooperate fully." Isabella realized that Blackwood was planning to force her into signing the marriage contract immediately, probably using Alexander's safety as leverage. She had the evidence she needed to expose his crimes, but now she had to figure out how to use it before he could carry out his threats. Isabella managed to escape through the secret passage just moments before Blackwood entered his office. Her hands were shaking as she clutched the small camera containing the photographic evidence of his conspiracy. She now had proof of his betrayal, but she needed to act quickly before he could harm Alexander or force her into the unwanted marriage. Thomas was waiting for her in the hidden corridor, his face tense with worry. "Did you find what you were looking for, Your Highness?" "More than I bargained for," Isabella whispered, showing him the camera. "Blackwood isn't just betraying me. He's been selling secrets to multiple kingdoms and orchestrating conflicts for his own profit. But right now, Alexander is in immediate danger, and I need to get this evidence to someone who can help." Thomas considered their options carefully. "Your father, the king, is the obvious choice, but reaching him safely at this hour might be difficult. Blackwood has loyal guards positioned throughout the palace, and if he suspects you've discovered his scheme, he might try to stop you from reaching the king." Isabella realized they needed a different approach. "What about Captain Morrison of the Royal Guard? He's been loyal to our family for 20 years, and he's never been influenced by Blackwood's political games." "Captain Morrison would be perfect," Thomas agreed. "He's conducting the midnight security inspection right now, which means he's somewhere in the palace grounds. If we can find him, he'll have the authority to arrest Blackwood and rescue your friend." They made their way through the secret passages toward the main guard quarters, But as they moved through the hidden corridors, Isabella heard sounds of commotion coming from the direction of the garden. Shouting voices, running footsteps, and what sounded like a struggle were echoing through the night air. "They're moving, Alexander," Isabella realized with growing panic. Blackwood must be taking him somewhere more secure, probably the dungeon beneath the East Tower. Thomas's expression grew grim. The dungeon is nearly impossible to escape from, and once someone is imprisoned there, Blackwood can control all access to them. If your friend is taken there, it might be too late to save him. Isabella made a desperate decision. "Thomas, I need you to find Captain Morrison and show him the evidence. Tell him everything I've told you and make sure he understands that Blackwood is planning to force me into signing the marriage contract tomorrow morning. What about you, Your Highness? Where will you go?" "I'm going to try to help Alexander myself," Isabella replied, though she wasn't sure how she could possibly succeed against armed guards and palace security. Thomas looked concerned but nodded. "There's another secret passage that leads near the dungeon entrance. It's dangerous and narrow, but it might give you a chance to see what's happening without being detected." He quickly gave her directions to the passage, along with a small lantern and his master keys. "Be very careful, Princess. Blackwood has shown that he's willing to use violence, and if he realizes you're trying to interfere with his plans, he might decide that you're too dangerous to keep alive." Isabella hugged the kind old groundskeeper briefly, then set off through the dark corridors toward the dungeon. As she moved through the secret passages, she could hear the sounds of the struggle growing louder. Men were shouting orders, and she could distinctly hear Alexander's voice raised in protest. The passage Thomas had described was indeed narrow and treacherous. Isabella had to crawl through several sections, and the ancient stone walls were damp and crumbling. But eventually she reached a small opening that allowed her to see into the area near the dungeon entrance. What she saw made her blood run cold. Alexander was being dragged toward the heavy iron door of the dungeon by 2 guards, while Blackwood supervised the operation. Alexander's face was bruised and his diplomatic clothes were torn and dirty. But despite his obvious pain, he was still fighting against his captors with remarkable courage. "You're making a serious mistake." "Blackwood," Alexander called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I'm an official representative of the Astorian court. Imprisoning me without cause will create a diplomatic crisis that could lead to war between our kingdoms." Blackwood laughed coldly. "War? I think not. By tomorrow evening you'll have confessed to espionage and been executed as a spy. The Astorian court will be told that you were caught stealing military secrets, and they'll be too embarrassed by your disgrace to seek revenge." "You can't forge evidence of espionage," Alexander protested. "The diplomatic community will investigate and they'll discover the truth." "Will they?" Blackwood pulled out a bag that clearly contained official documents. "I have letters here, written in your handwriting, that detail your plans to steal our military plans and report them to your government. Amazing how much a man will confess when properly motivated." Isabella realized that Blackwood had forged incriminating evidence and was planning to frame Alexander for treason. The Chancellor had thought of everything, including how to explain Alexander's disappearance to the international community. As the guards began to unlock the dungeon door, Isabella knew she had to act immediately. She couldn't overpower armed men, but she might be able to create enough of a distraction to help Alexander escape, or at least delay his imprisonment until Captain Morrison could arrive with reinforcements. Noticed that the area near the dungeon entrance was lit by several torches mounted on the walls. If she could somehow extinguish the lights, it might create enough confusion for Alexander to break free from his captors. The guards would be temporarily blinded, and in the darkness anything might be possible. Isabella carefully made her way closer to the dungeon entrance, staying hidden in the shadows. She could see a bucket of water near the entrance that was probably used for cleaning. If she could reach it without being detected, she might be able to douse several torches simultaneously. But as she prepared to make her move, she heard new footsteps approaching from another direction. More guards were arriving, which would make any rescue attempt much more dangerous. Isabella realized that she might have only one chance to help Alexander, and if she failed, they would both be at Blackwood's mercy. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Isabella prepared to risk everything for the man she loved. She had never attempted anything so dangerous in her life, but Alexander's life hung in the balance, and she couldn't bear the thought of letting Blackwood destroy him with lies and forged evidence. Isabella waited for the perfect moment when the guards were distracted by the heavy dungeon door's rusty lock mechanism. Moving as quietly as possible, she crept toward the water bucket, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The stone floor was uneven and slippery, making each step treacherous in the dim torchlight. Just as she reached for the bucket, one of the approaching guards stumbled over a loose stone, cursing loudly as he caught his balance. The distraction was exactly what Isabella needed. She grabbed the water bucket and threw its contents across 3 of the closest torches, immediately plunging that section of the corridor into darkness. The sudden darkness caused immediate chaos. The guards shouted in confusion, loosening their grip on Alexander as they tried to understand what had happened. Blackwood's voice rose above the commotion, demanding that someone restore the lights immediately. Alexander, despite his bound hands, managed to twist away from his captors and began running toward the darker sections of the corridor. But with his hands tied behind his back, his balance was poor and he couldn't move as quickly as necessary to escape completely. "Find them both!" Blackwood screamed furiously. "The princess is here somewhere. She's the one who extinguished the lights. Don't let either of them escape." Isabella realized that Blackwood had figured out her involvement much more quickly than she had hoped. She needed to help Alexander with his bound hands, but the guards were already beginning to spread out and search the darkened area systematically. Using her knowledge of the palace layout, Isabella called out softly to Alexander, guiding him toward a narrow side passage that led to the old wine cellars. If they could reach that area, they would have access to multiple escape routes and hiding places. "This way," she whispered urgently as Alexander stumbled toward her voice. "There's a passage behind the wine racks that leads back to the main palace." But as they hurried through the narrow corridor, Isabella could hear the guards getting closer. Blackwood had brought more men than she had initially realized, and they were systematically checking every possible hiding place. Worse yet, some of the guards had brought additional torches, making it much harder to hide in the shadows. "Isabella, you shouldn't have come," Alexander whispered as they paused near the entrance to the wine cellar. "Blackwood is completely ruthless. If he captures you, he'll use you as leverage to force your father into agreeing to anything he wants. I couldn't let him destroy you with his lies and forged evidence," Isabella replied, working quickly to untie the ropes around Alexander's wrists. "Besides, I have proof of his crimes now. If we can just escape and get to Captain Morrison, we can expose everything." As the ropes finally came loose, Alexander rubbed his wrists gratefully. "What kind of proof?" Isabella quickly explained what she had discovered in Blackwood's office: the correspondence with Prince Edmund, the evidence of selling information to foreign courts, and the surveillance reports documenting her private activities. "He's been planning this for months," she concluded. "The blackmail letter was just the final step in a much larger scheme to control both my future and the kingdom's political relationships." Alexander's expression grew grim as he realized the full scope of Blackwood's betrayal. If he's been selling information to multiple kingdoms, then he's probably responsible for several recent conflicts between neighboring countries. He's been profiting from wars and suffering while pretending to serve your father loyally. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. The guards had reached the wine cellar area and were beginning to search systematically through the storage areas. Isabella and Alexander pressed themselves against the wall behind a large wine rack, hoping to remain hidden until the searchers moved on. But their luck ran out when one of the guards noticed that some of the wine bottles had been disturbed recently. "They came through here," the guard called out to his companions. "Search every hiding place carefully." Isabella realized they had only moments before being discovered. She remembered that Thomas had mentioned a secondary passage that connected the wine cellar to the palace's old laundry facilities, but reaching it would require crossing an open area where they might be seen. "We have to run for it," she whispered to Alexander. "There's another passage across the cellar, but we'll be exposed for several seconds." Alexander nodded grimly. "On the count of 3. 1, 2. But before they could move, a new voice echoed through the cellar, Captain Morrison's authoritative command cutting through the chaos like a sword. "By order of King Frederick, all guards are to stand down immediately. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, you are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and conduct unbecoming of a royal official." Isabella felt a surge of relief and hope. Thomas had found Captain Morrison and convinced him to investigate the situation. But her relief was short-lived when she heard Blackwood's response. "Captain Morrison, you're making a serious mistake," Blackwood called out, his voice still confident despite the accusations. "Princess Isabella has been compromised by enemy agents, and she's been feeding information to this Astorian spy. I have evidence of their treasonous activities, and I was attempting to arrest them both when they attacked my guards and tried to escape." Isabella realized that Blackwood was trying to turn the situation around, using his forged evidence and his reputation for loyalty to convince Captain Morrison that she and Alexander were the real criminals. The Chancellor was skilled at manipulation and might be able to convince even honest men like Morrison if his lies were convincing enough. "Captain Morrison," Isabella called out, stepping into view despite the danger. "I have photographic evidence, proving that Lord Chancellor Blackwood has been betraying our kingdom for years. He's been selling secrets to foreign courts and orchestrating conflicts for his own profit. The confrontation that followed would determine not just her own fate and Alexander's life, but potentially the future stability of multiple kingdoms. Blackwood's schemes had been years in the making, but now everything would be decided in the next few minutes based on whose story Captain Morrison chose to believe." Captain Morrison stood in the torchlight, his weathered face showing the strain of having to choose between two conflicting accounts from people he had served faithfully for years. His hand rested on his sword hilt as he studied both Isabella and Blackwood, clearly weighing their words carefully. "Princess Isabella," Captain Morrison said slowly, "these are very serious accusations you're making against the Lord Chancellor. He has served your father loyally for 15 years and has been instrumental in negotiating several important treaties that have brought peace and prosperity to our kingdom." Blackwood stepped forward confidently, his elegant robes and composed demeanor making him appear every inch the dignified royal official. "Captain Morrison, I understand your confusion, but the evidence speaks for itself. This young man," he gestured toward Alexander, "has been systematically gathering intelligence about our military capabilities and diplomatic strategies. Princess Isabella has been unknowingly manipulated by his romantic advances into revealing sensitive information." "That's completely false," Isabella protested, pulling out the small camera containing the photographic evidence. "Captain Morrison, I have proof right here that Lord Chancellor Blackwood has been corresponding with Prince Edmund about controlling me after our marriage. I also have evidence that he's been selling information to multiple foreign courts and profiting from the conflicts he's helped create." Alexander stepped forward, despite the obvious pain from his earlier beating. "Captain Morrison, I am Lord Alexander Hartwell, official diplomatic representative of the Astorian court. I have come here openly, with full credentials to participate in legitimate diplomatic discussions. Lord Chancellor Blackwood has attempted to frame me for espionage using forged documents that he created himself." Captain Morrison looked increasingly troubled as he listened to both sides of the story. "Lord Chancellor, if you have evidence of espionage, I would need to see it immediately. And Princess Isabella, if you have proof of the Chancellor's alleged crimes, I must examine that evidence as well." Blackwood reached into his robes and produced the bag of forged documents he had shown earlier. "Here are letters written in Lord Alexander's own handwriting, detailing his plans to steal our military secrets and report them to his government. The handwriting analysis will confirm their authenticity." Isabella realized that Blackwood's forgeries might be sophisticated enough to fool even experts, at least temporarily. She needed to present her evidence in a way that would immediately expose his lies. "Captain Morrison," Isabella said urgently, "before you examine those documents, please look at these photographs. They show correspondence between Lord Chancellor Blackwood and Prince Edmund that reveals the true nature of my arranged marriage. Prince Edmund specifically requested information about my personality and vulnerabilities so that he could properly control his future wife after our wedding." She handed Captain Morrison the camera, explaining how to view the images she had captured in Blackwood's office. As the captain examined the evidence, his expression grew increasingly grim. "There's more," Isabella continued. "The photographs also show records of payments Blackwood has received from multiple foreign courts in exchange for confidential information about our kingdom's military and diplomatic activities. He's been playing different countries against each other while profiting from the conflicts he's helped orchestrate. Blackwood's confident demeanor began to crack as he realized that Isabella had obtained far more damaging evidence than he had anticipated. Captain Morrison, those photographs could easily be forgeries created by enemy agents. The princess has clearly been compromised by this spy, and she may not even realize how thoroughly she's been manipulated. But Captain Morrison was studying the images carefully, and his expression showed that he was beginning to recognize the truth. Lord Chancellor, I'm seeing correspondence here that bears your official seal and signature. The handwriting appears to match documents I've seen you write personally. How do you explain these financial records showing payments from foreign sources? Those documents have obviously been tampered with, Blackwood replied, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. Any skilled forger could replicate my handwriting and seal. Alexander stepped forward again. Captain Morrison, there's something else you should know. Lord Chancellor Blackwood threatened to have me executed as a spy, and claimed he would tell the Astorian court that I had been caught stealing military secrets. He said my diplomatic immunity wouldn't protect me because he had ways of making that disappear. Those aren't the words of a man who's concerned about proper legal procedures. Captain Morrison's jaw tightened as he processed this information. He had served the royal family long enough to recognize the difference between legitimate security concerns and personal corruption. The evidence Isabella had provided, combined with Alexander's testimony, and Blackwood's increasingly desperate explanations, was painting a clear picture of betrayal and conspiracy. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, Captain Morrison said formally, I am placing you under arrest pending a full investigation of these allegations. You will surrender your official seal and keys immediately, and you will be confined to the palace detention quarters until King Frederick can personally review this evidence. Blackwood's mask of dignity finally slipped completely. You're making a terrible mistake, Morrison. I've been protecting this kingdom while you've been playing soldier. Without my guidance, King Frederick would have led us into a dozen unnecessary wars. And apparently you've been profiting from those wars you claim to have prevented, Captain Morrison replied coldly. Guards, escort the former Lord Chancellor to detention. Be sure to search him thoroughly for any additional documents or weapons. As the guards moved to arrest Blackwood, Isabella felt a tremendous sense of relief. The immediate danger was over and Alexander was safe. But she knew that the real consequences of Blackwood's betrayal were just beginning to unfold. The political ramifications would be enormous, affecting not just her own future but the relationships between multiple kingdoms. Alexander approached her as Blackwood was led away, his face showing both gratitude and concern. Isabella, you risked everything to save me. I can never adequately express how much your courage means to me. You would have done the same for me, Isabella replied, taking his hand gently. But now we need to face the reality of what comes next. My father will need to be informed immediately, and the political situation will be incredibly complex. Captain Morrison overheard their conversation and nodded gravely. Princess Isabella, I'm afraid you're right about the complications ahead. This conspiracy reaches far beyond just your personal situation. We'll need to investigate how much damage Blackwood has done to our kingdom's security and relationships with other countries. 3 hours later, Isabella stood in her father's private study as King Frederick examined the evidence she had gathered against Lord Chancellor Blackwood. The morning sun was beginning to filter through the tall windows, casting golden light across the room, where so many important decisions had been made over the years. King Frederick looked older than his 55 years as he studied the photographs and documents spread across his desk. His trusted advisor of 15 years had betrayed not just the crown, but the fundamental principles of loyalty and honor that held their kingdom together. The scope of Blackwood's deception was staggering, affecting diplomatic relationships, military security, and the personal lives of the royal family. Isabella, the king said quietly, his voice heavy with both sadness and pride, you showed remarkable courage in exposing this conspiracy. Your quick thinking and willingness to risk your own safety saved not just Lord Alexander's life, but potentially prevented a much larger diplomatic crisis. Father, I'm sorry I didn't come to you immediately when I first suspected something was wrong, Isabella replied, sitting across from him in the chair she had occupied countless times during their private conversations over the years. I was afraid that my feelings for Alexander would cloud my judgment about what was best for the kingdom. King Frederick smiled sadly. My daughter, one of the most difficult aspects of being a ruler is learning when to trust your heart and when to set personal feelings aside for the greater good. In this case, your heart led you to uncover a threat that my advisors and I completely missed. Alexander stood respectfully near the window, still wearing his torn diplomatic clothes from the previous night's ordeal. Your Majesty, I want you to know that my feelings for Princess Isabella developed genuinely without any ulterior motives. I never intended to complicate the political situation between our kingdoms, Lord Alexander, the king replied thoughtfully. I've reviewed your diplomatic credentials and spoken with representatives from the Astorian court this morning. Your reputation for integrity and honor is well established, and I believe your intentions toward my daughter are sincere. Isabella felt a surge of hope, but she knew the political realities were still complex. Father, what about the marriage arrangement with Prince Edmund? And how will we handle the diplomatic fallout from Blackwood's betrayal?
King Frederick stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where Isabella and Alexander had conducted their secret meetings.
The marriage arrangement with Prince Edmund was based on Blackwood's recommendations and his assurances about Edmund's character. Given what we now know about Blackwood's true motivations and the evidence of Edmund's cruel intentions toward you, that arrangement is obviously void. But won't canceling the marriage create problems with Valoria? Isabella asked, concerned about the broader implications. Actually, the opposite may be true, the king explained. I've already sent urgent messages to King Marcus of Valoria, explaining the situation and providing evidence of Prince Edmund's involvement in Blackwood's scheme. It appears that Edmund was operating without his father's knowledge or approval. King Marcus is reportedly furious about his son's behavior and the threat it posed to diplomatic relations. Alexander stepped forward respectfully. Your Majesty, if I may ask, what will happen to Lord Chancellor Blackwood? His crimes extend far beyond this kingdom, and other courts will need to be informed about his activities. Blackwood will face trial for treason, conspiracy, and corruption, the king replied firmly. The evidence Isabella gathered is more than sufficient to convict him, and we're already working with other kingdoms to assess the full extent of the damage he's caused. Several ongoing conflicts between neighboring countries appear to have been orchestrated or worsened by information he provided to multiple sides. Isabella felt relieved that justice would be served, but she was still uncertain about her own future. Father, where does this leave me? I know my marriage is important for the kingdom's alliances and security. King Frederick returned to his desk and picked up a formal-looking document that Isabella hadn't noticed before. This morning I received a fascinating proposal from the Astorian court. They've formally requested permission for Lord Alexander to court you officially, with the possibility of marriage if both parties are agreeable. Isabella's heart leapt with joy, but she tried to maintain her composure. What would that mean for our kingdom's relationships and alliances? It would actually strengthen our position significantly, the king explained. Astoria is a wealthy, stable kingdom with strong trade relationships throughout the region. A marriage alliance with them would provide economic benefits that are arguably superior to what the Valorian arrangement would have offered. More importantly, it would be based on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than political manipulation. Alexander's face showed amazement and gratitude. Your Majesty, I'm deeply honored by this opportunity. I promise you that I will spend my life ensuring Princess Isabella's happiness and working to strengthen the bonds between our kingdoms. I believe you will, the king replied with a smile. However, I have one condition. This courtship will be conducted openly and properly with full diplomatic protocols. No more secret meetings in the garden, no matter how romantic they might seem. Isabella laughed for the first time in days, feeling as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. I promise, Father. Though I have to admit the secret meetings did make everything feel more exciting. Real love doesn't need secrecy to be exciting, the king observed wisely. It grows stronger when it can flourish in the light of truth and honesty. Over the following weeks, the full extent of Blackwood's crimes became clear as investigators from multiple kingdoms worked together to uncover his network of corruption and manipulation. His trial became a landmark case in international law, establishing new protocols for detecting and preventing similar betrayals in the future. Isabella and Alexander's courtship proceeded under the watchful but benevolent eyes of both royal courts. Their genuine affection for each other, combined with their shared experience of overcoming adversity together, created a strong foundation for their relationship. 6 months later, Princess Isabella and Lord Alexander were married in a celebration that brought together representatives from dozens of kingdoms. Their wedding became not just a union of two people who loved each other, but a symbol of how truth and courage could triumph over deception and corruption. As Isabella stood beside Alexander during their wedding ceremony, she reflected on how the terrifying events that had threatened to destroy her happiness had ultimately led to a future more wonderful than she had ever imagined possible. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest challenges in life were actually opportunities in disguise, waiting for someone brave enough to face them with integrity and determination. The kingdom of Ravencrest flourished under new leadership that prioritized honesty and genuine diplomatic relationships over manipulation and secret schemes. And in the palace gardens where Isabella and Alexander had once met in secret, they now walked openly together, their love having proven strong enough to survive conspiracy, betrayal, and the complex demands of royal duty.